Thank you very much, James. You know, this is really a pleasure for me because most of the time when I speak in public, it's either in a bankruptcy court or I'm on the witness stand or in front of a room full of rather unhappy creditors. So this is really a pleasure. I was asked to speak tonight by the Foreign Policy Association, and I wanted to thank Noel, the members and guests, and my friends and colleagues. It's a great honor to be with you tonight, and I'm very proud to receive this extraordinarily heavy medal in our recognition as one of the architects of the three-year effort that successfully restored the city of Detroit to solvency. It would be a crowded stage indeed if all the other participants, and there were hundreds, particularly my colleagues from Miller, Buckfire, and Jones Day, were at my side. So I'm accepting this medal on their behalf as well. Now, Detroit, for those of you who haven't been there, is 600 miles west of the Pierre Hotel, and it is not in Canada, just to be clear. Although the Canadians would be very happy to have it back, but that's a story for a different night. Why should this restructuring be of interest to this group? And why is it being recognized by the FPA tonight? Well, perhaps the Detroit experience could be applicable to foreign governments in financial distress and to other U.S. state and local governments that are struggling with unpayable liabilities. Detroit restructured $19 billion in liabilities. Are the lessons applicable to Puerto Rico, for example, with 120 to 160 billion of liabilities, or even to Greece with euro 400 billion? Well, I think there are lessons here, and I think one of the most important ones was that Detroit uniquely was a collaboration between the public and private sectors based upon, really for the first time, very well-established financial principles that will be no stranger to anybody in this room. Governor Snyder is a political leader who has supported applying a corporate approach to restructuring Detroit. It required strong political leadership from Governor Snyder and the Michigan legislature. The Michigan government wanted, uniquely, a permanent solution of Detroit's financial problems so that it could be restarted as the economic engine of the Michigan economy. They were tired of solutions which only kicked the can down the road and supported the status quo. Does that sound familiar to anybody in this room? Detroit may be the first time that corporate restructuring principles were successfully applied to a government. The strategic objectives were to restore public services and reestablish conditions supporting growth. Reinvesting in public services would attract new private sector investment, which would lead to growth in tax revenues and a growing population, replacing the death spiral that had been in for decades with a virtuous circle of reinforcement. It may also have been the first time that any government required that bondholders, current and retired city employees, the normal competitors for scarce resources, were told they would only get paid after setting aside $1.5 billion to reinvest in the city. Spending that much money on the city to reinvest and restore services was the first priority and the centerpiece of Detroit's restructuring plan. Now, this took 2 years to plan, but only 15 months to implement, the reverse of what you normally see. The governor's strategic objectives were clear. He made economic growth a priority. He also made treating the creditors equally and fairly a priority, and he wanted to make sure that their rights under the law were respected. So the secured creditors got paid first, everybody else got paid after that, as much as we had available. And most importantly, he provided for long-term oversight from a financial control board. You may have read about this idea being applied in other jurisdictions. They borrowed it from us, we borrowed it from New York City. It's a good idea, but it has to be applied quite correctly. Since Detroit emerged in December of 2014, a little over a year ago, it has made extraordinary progress. To cite a couple of important metrics, 911 calls, which used to take 1 hour for the police to respond to, are now under 10 minutes. And every light in the city is now on where they had been half dark for decades. So it's early days, but the city is definitely on its way. However, these principles which I've just cited, which are taken for granted in corporate restructurings, are not being followed by other governments facing financial distress, including Puerto Rico and Greece. Lobbying and special pleading by financial and political constituencies crowd out investing for the future. With all due respect to my creditor friends in the audience, you can't escape being part of the solution because, unfortunately now, creditors are part of the problem. For example, the financial restructuring imposed upon Greece encourages the most productive citizens to either emigrate or enter the shadow economy. When I was in Greece 2 weeks ago, the consequences of these policies are visible. There's no traffic on the streets, all the stores are shuttered, there are homeless people everywhere, and there are demonstrations and strikes on almost a daily basis. We just don't read about it now because, unfortunately, people want to talk about potential President Trump. But there is also no economic growth in Puerto Rico and in Greece for those reasons. So what happens when citizens no longer receive adequate public services for their tax money? Everybody ultimately loses. Creditors and benefit holders have a stake in the government delivering adequate public services. If the tax rates are crippling, if public services are inadequate, and productive citizens emigrate to Germany or the United Kingdom, who will be left to pay interest on the debt and to fund social benefits? And this is what happened in Detroit. Some of you may know that in the 1950s, Detroit was the wealthiest city in the world. Over 2 million people lived in Detroit. By the time it went through bankruptcy 2 years ago, the population was down to 700,000, and there were only 35,000 private sector jobs in the entire city. And everybody had moved to the suburbs. So now let's turn to Puerto Rico, which is a U.S. Commonwealth and a home to 3.5 million U.S. citizens. It is not a foreign country, although it's being treated that way by some people. After decades of declining economic growth, Puerto Rico has accumulated between $120 and $160 billion in liabilities, of which only $72 billion is debt, and most of that is unsecured. Puerto Rico's current plan, on which it has wasted 3 years and tens of millions of fees, is to impose material debt reduction on its bondholders so that it can maintain the social status quo. This plan violates some of the most important legal principles underpinning the capital markets and will leave Puerto Rico not only serviced but financially insolvent. The plan will accomplish nothing but kicking the can down the road, which is, by the way, typical of this kind of restructuring. When restructurings are designed to placate either the bondholders or the benefit holders, the consequences are condemning millions of people to lives of poverty and unproductive careers. Without appropriate debt relief and restoration of economic growth, both Greece and Puerto Rico will probably become permanent expenses in the budgets of the European community and the United States. Sovereign governments cannot liquidate themselves in order to pay their debts. Creditors who try to enforce promises made in contracts will wind up with Argentina if you're lucky, or with pennies on the dollar if you're unlucky. The best outcome for citizens and creditors is to use available resources to restart economic growth. Only then should the various constituencies argue over the relative fairness of their recoveries. Otherwise, citizens and businesses will vote with their feet. In the United States, bankruptcy, the world I know, provides a framework in which debtors can rehabilitate themselves while respecting the rights of creditors. It is a legal and not a political process. Congress should pass legislation giving Puerto Rico its second chance without setting bad precedents for the capital markets and ensuring that whatever pain must be inflicted upon creditors and benefit holders is not in vain. And the European Central Bank should arbitrate between Greece and its creditors. Restarting economic growth should be the center point of all restructuring plans, whether for a corporation or for a country or a city. Rarely is that the case in the sovereign world. It should be, because the consequences of it not being are dire and permanent. Thank you very much for your time and for this honor this evening.